Your badge has been permanently deactivated, Miss Carter. The words landed softly, almost politely, but the silence that followed felt heavier than concrete. Naomi Carter stood motionless in front of the glass security gate on the 48th floor, while the red scanner light blinked against her dark skin like a warning pulse. Around her, the lobby of Vail and Mercer Holdings hummed with the low mechanical sound of elevators and distant keyboards, but nobody nearby looked directly at her. They looked down. At coffee cups. At phones. At reflections in polished marble. Anything except the black woman who had walked into this building as CEO for the last 4 years, and had just been locked out of her own executive floor. Naomi slowly removed her hand from the scanner. Her nails were perfectly still. No shaking. No anger. Just stillness. The kind that made people nervous. The young white security guard swallowed hard behind the desk. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said carefully. "I was told not to override it." Naomi looked at him for a moment. Not cruelly. Not even coldly. Just tired. "Who told you?" she asked quietly. The guard hesitated. That hesitation answered enough. Upstairs, somewhere beyond layers of tinted glass and walnut-paneled conference walls, somebody had already decided she no longer belonged. Naomi adjusted the sleeve of her charcoal coat and glanced toward the elevator bank. Outside the towering windows behind her, Manhattan disappeared beneath cold November rain. Water crawled down the glass in crooked silver lines while yellow taxi lights smeared across the streets below like melted paint. A cleaning woman pushing a cart near the reception area paused for half a second when she recognized Naomi. Their eyes met briefly. Something passed silently between them. Recognition. Embarrassment. Maybe even fear. Then the woman lowered her head and kept walking. Naomi pressed the elevator button herself. The silver doors opened almost immediately. As she stepped inside, she caught her reflection in the mirrored wall. Dark curls pulled neatly back. Gold earrings. Calm eyes. No sign of panic anywhere. But beneath the calm, something sharper moved quietly. Something observant. The elevator climbed in near silence except for the faint jazz piano drifting through hidden speakers overhead. Floor numbers lit one by one. 39. 40. 41. Naomi remembered riding this same elevator 6 years earlier carrying box files because nobody in upper management knew her name back then. Daughter of a janitor. Howard University graduate buried in compliance reports while men with polished smiles took credit for work they barely understood. She remembered the looks. The surprise every time she entered a room too expensive for someone who looked like her. She remembered learning early that competence made people uncomfortable when it came wrapped in black skin and a calm voice. Ding. 48th floor. The doors slid open. The boardroom entrance stood illuminated beneath recessed lighting, the company logo glowing against a black marble wall. But what stopped Naomi cold was the laughter drifting through the slightly open conference doors. Comfortable laughter. Relaxed laughter. The kind people made when they thought the hard part was already over. Naomi walked forward slowly, heels clicking softly against polished stone. As she reached the doorway, the room came into full view. 12 executives sat around the massive walnut table beneath warm amber lights. Steam rose from untouched coffee cups. Digital reports glowed blue across tablets and laptops. At the far end of the room sat Ethan Pierce. In her chair. Her leather notebook rested beside him like discarded property. Ethan adjusted his cufflinks and smiled faintly when he saw her standing there. Richard Hale, silver-haired chairman of the board, didn't smile at all. He simply folded his hands and said, "Naomi, we were just about to begin." Nobody else spoke. Nobody stood up. And then Naomi noticed the final detail that made the entire room suddenly feel 10 degrees colder. The brass nameplate in front of the CEO seat no longer said Naomi Carter. The air inside the boardroom felt unnaturally warm, thick with the smell of espresso, leather, and rain-damp wool coats. Naomi stood at the doorway for another second, her eyes fixed not on Ethan Pierce, but on the empty space. Where her nameplate had been. A faint rectangular outline remained on the polished walnut surface, slightly darker than the rest of the table, like proof that someone had tried to erase her too quickly. Ethan leaned back comfortably in the chair, adjusting the cuff of his navy suit with slow confidence. He was younger than most men on the board, handsome in the polished way investors trusted instantly. White teeth, Clean haircut. Expensive watch catching the overhead light every time he moved his wrist. The kind of man magazines called reassuring. Please, Richard Hale said, gesturing toward an open seat near the far end of the table. Not beside him. Not near leadership. At the far end. Like a guest invited too late. Naomi glanced around the room. Some executives avoided eye contact completely. Others stared too long before quickly looking away. One woman cleared her throat and pretended to review numbers on a tablet that had not changed screens in over a minute. Nobody looked comfortable. That told Naomi more than words could. She walked slowly toward the empty chair. Her heels clicked softly against the hardwood floor. Each step measured, controlled. No anger. No scene. The silence stretched tighter with every second she remained calm. Ethan finally smiled. I hope this transition can remain professional, he said. Naomi pulled out the chair without looking at him. Professional, she repeated softly, sitting down. The leather seat was colder than she expected. Richard folded his hands carefully on the table. As you know, the board voted early this morning to appoint interim leadership during restructuring negotiations. Naomi opened her leather notebook. Blank pages. Gold-edged corners. Interesting, she said calmly. I do not remember receiving notice of a vote. Richard's jaw tightened almost invisibly. Emergency powers allow immediate action under certain conditions. Naomi nodded once, as if filing the sentence away somewhere deeper than memory. Outside the towering windows, thunder rolled faintly over Manhattan. Gray clouds pressed low across the skyline while streaks of rain crawled down the glass behind Ethan's chair. The city looked blurred. Distorted. Like something seen underwater. Investors have expressed concerns. Ethan continued smoothly. The market needs confidence right now. Naomi finally looked at him directly. Confidence in what? Ethan held her gaze half a second too long before answering. Stability. The word hung in the room like smoke. Nobody moved. Naomi noticed Angela Brooks near the middle of the table, fingers resting motionless on a closed legal folder. Angela did not look at Ethan. She was looking at Richard instead, watching him carefully. Naomi recognized that look immediately. Angela had found something. Richard cleared his throat. We should begin with quarterly projections. A large presentation screen flickered to life across the room. Charts appeared. Market forecasts. International acquisition figures. But Naomi barely glanced at them. Her attention shifted toward the reflection in the window behind Ethan. Reflections always revealed what faces tried to hide. She saw Ethan loosen his collar slightly. Saw Richard rub his thumb against his wedding ring repeatedly beneath the table. Nervous habits. Tiny cracks. Then it happened. Angela's phone vibrated once against the wood. A small sound. Almost nothing. But Angela's eyes sharpened immediately as she read the message. Naomi saw the color drain slightly from her face. Slowly, Angela lifted her gaze toward Naomi across the table. No words. Just a look. A warning. And at that exact moment, every screen in the boardroom flickered red for half a second before stabilizing again. Ethan frowned. What was that? Nobody answered. But somewhere deep inside the building, Naomi could feel it already. Something had started moving beneath the surface. The red flicker vanished so quickly that half the room pretended it never happened. Ethan glanced around the table with a tight smile that did not fully reach his eyes. Probably a systems refresh, he said lightly, though his fingers had already moved toward his phone beneath the table. Naomi remained still. The overhead lights reflected softly against the dark glass wall behind her, outlining her silhouette in silver edges while rain continued tapping faintly against the windows. Richard Hale shifted in his chair and cleared his throat again. Continue with the Asia projections, he ordered. One of the analysts near the center of the table quickly switched slides. Revenue charts appeared. Currency forecasts. Acquisition targets in Singapore and Dubai. Numbers filled the room, but nobody seemed fully focused anymore. There was tension now, thin and electric. Like the moment before a storm finally breaks open. Naomi quietly uncapped her pen. She did not write anything. She simply listened. Across the table, Angela opened her legal folder halfway, shielding the contents from the others. Her eyes moved once toward Naomi before dropping back down. That single glance carried urgency. Naomi noticed the edge of a printed document beneath the folder flap. Internal authorization logs. Time-stamped. Her stomach tightened slightly. Not fear. Recognition. Someone had moved too fast this morning. Mistakes happen when people rushed power. Ethan continued speaking confidently about repositioning the company image, while a few board members nodded along with visible relief, eager to attach themselves to whichever direction looked safest. The investors needed reassurance, Ethan said. They needed leadership that projects steadiness during volatility. Naomi finally spoke. Quietly. And I did not project that? The question floated across the room so softly that nobody interrupted it. Ethan leaned back carefully. This is not personal. Richard stared down at the polished table instead of at her. That told Naomi everything. A senior board member named Charles Whitmore adjusted his glasses and muttered, almost under his breath, "Perception matters on Wall Street." Naomi turned toward him slowly. Charles suddenly became very interested in his coffee. Outside, thunder rolled again, lower this time. The building seemed to vibrate faintly beneath it. Naomi folded her hands together. Perception, she repeated calmly. Interesting word. Nobody answered, because everybody in that room understood what had not been said aloud. Vail and Mercer had survived scandals, lawsuits, and market crashes under Naomi's leadership. Stock value had tripled in 4 years. Debt had been cut nearly in half. International expansion had succeeded because of systems she personally built. But none of that erased the discomfort some investors still felt seeing a black woman at the top of a billion-dollar empire. Competence had made her respected. It had never made her fully accepted. A sudden vibration buzzed across the table. Then another. Phones lighting up one after another. Several executives frowned simultaneously, while reading incoming alerts. Ethan's smile faded first. "What is this?" he asked sharply. One analyst swallowed hard. "Sir, our trading dashboard is showing irregular activity." Richard held out his hand impatiently. "Define irregular." The analyst hesitated. "Multiple offshore accounts just triggered automated freezes." Silence. Ethan sat up straighter now. That should not even be possible without executive authorization. Naomi looked toward the rain-streaked windows. Reflections moved faintly across the glass behind the room. Nervous faces. Pale collars. Tight jaws. Angela finally spoke for the first time all morning. "Actually," she said carefully, "those safeguards were personally designed by Naomi." Ethan turned toward her sharply. "Then removed the freeze." Angela did not answer immediately. She closed the legal folder slowly before looking directly at him. "I do not think you understand," she said. "The system may not recognize your authority yet." The room went completely still. Even the air conditioning seemed quieter suddenly. Naomi lowered her eyes briefly toward the untouched notebook in front of her. Then she noticed something else. Her company email had just reactivated itself. The tiny notification glowed at the corner of Naomi's laptop screen like a pulse returning to life. Access restored. For 1 second, she simply stared at it while the room around her grew louder with restrained panic. Executives whispered over one another now. Tablets refreshed continuously. Red indicators flashed across financial dashboards reflected in anxious eyes and polished conference glass. Ethan reached for the control tablet beside him, fingers moving faster than before. "Why are the compliance locks escalating?" he demanded. "Who authorized this?" Nobody answered quickly enough. Naomi closed her laptop halfway without reacting. Calmness had become unbearable to them now. Richard Hale loosened his tie for the first time that morning. The movement looked small, but Naomi noticed several people watching him immediately afterward. Leadership always leaked through body language before words. Outside the windows, rain hammered harder against the glass, turning the skyline beyond the boardroom into a blur of gray steel and scattered lights. Somewhere below, traffic crawled through Manhattan like glowing veins beneath the storm. Angela slid a document silently across the table toward Naomi. Her fingertips barely touched the wood. Naomi opened it carefully. Internal security authorization logs. Timestamp. 5:12 a.m. executive override initiated. User credentials. Richard Hale. Secondary authorization. Ethan Pierce. Naomi read the page once. Then again. Not because she was shocked, because the details mattered. The system removal had been rushed, incomplete, sloppy in ways Richard would never normally allow, which meant fear had pushed them into acting before they were ready. This cannot be happening right now, Ethan muttered, refreshing another dashboard. One of the analysts swallowed visibly. Sir, international regulators are requesting verification keys for the Singapore accounts. Then send them, Ethan snapped. We cannot, the analyst replied quietly. The encryption chain still requires final executive authentication. Ethan froze. Slowly, he looked toward Naomi for the first time not as an obstacle, but as a problem he suddenly did not know how to solve. Naomi leaned back slightly in her chair. You removed my authority before understanding what it controlled, she said softly. Richard's eyes hardened. Do not make this theatrical. Naomi looked at him directly now. This is not theater, Richard. The room fell still again. She rarely used first names during board meetings. The familiarity made the tension sharper somehow. For 4 years, Naomi continued calmly, I rebuilt the company's internal risk structure after the Mercer investigation nearly destroyed us. Every offshore safeguard, every compliance lock, every automated fraud barrier was rebuilt under my authorization chain. Ethan frowned. Nobody mentioned that the system depended on one executive. Angela finally spoke again. It was designed that way intentionally. Her voice remained level, professional. After the federal inquiry 3 years ago, Naomi implemented isolated verification protocols to prevent unauthorized financial exposure. Charles Whitmore blinked behind his glasses. You mean she built a firewall around the entire corporation? Angela nodded once. Essentially. Silence. Real silence this time. Not awkwardness. Not discomfort. Realization. Naomi watched it spread across the room slowly, face by face, like people waking up underwater. Ethan looked down at the brass CEO nameplate in front of him. His own name had been installed hastily over hers, the edges slightly uneven where adhesive still clung beneath the metal. Suddenly it looked temporary. Cheap even. Richard folded his hands tighter. This can still be corrected internally. Naomi tilted her head slightly. Can it? Another vibration hit the table. Then another. Phones lighting up across the room almost simultaneously. Angela checked hers first. Her expression changed immediately. Not panic. Worse. Controlled concern. Federal Compliance Division just initiated a direct review, she said quietly. They flagged irregular executive authorization changes made this morning. Ethan's face lost color. Richard stared at the rain-dark windows without blinking. And for the first time since Naomi entered the room, nobody looked at her like she was the person who had lost power. The storm outside swallowed the skyline completely now. Water streaked down the 48th floor windows in restless waves while flashes of distant lightning illuminated the boardroom in pale white bursts. Inside, nobody touched the catered breakfast anymore. Coffee sat cooling beside trembling hands and glowing screens filled with alerts nobody fully understood. Ethan Pierce stared at the trading dashboard in front of him as numbers shifted faster than he could process. Why are the European accounts freezing too? He asked. Sharply. The analyst nearest the screen adjusted his glasses with unsteady fingers. The system is detecting unverified executive changes across all divisions. Then disable the system, Ethan snapped. We cannot, the analyst admitted quietly. The override chain still routes through original architecture. Silence followed immediately after those words. Not because people did not understand, because they finally did. Naomi sat motionless at the far end of the table, one hand resting lightly on her closed notebook. The overhead lights reflected softly against the gold edge of its pages, while the rain cast moving shadows across her face. Calm. Entirely calm. Richard Hale noticed it too. He had spent years inside negotiations, investigations, mergers worth billions of dollars. He understood pressure. But Naomi's silence unsettled him more than shouting ever could. This situation can still be stabilized, Richard said carefully. We simply need to restore temporary access until the review passes. Naomi looked toward him slowly. Temporary access, she repeated. That is interesting wording considering you revoked my authority before sunrise. Richard's jaw tightened again. Ethan leaned forward impatiently. This is not about feelings, he said. It is about protecting shareholder confidence. Naomi held his gaze for several quiet seconds. Shareholders trusted me when this company survived the Mercer collapse. Ethan said nothing. They trusted me when federal auditors found hidden liabilities in Singapore. Naomi's voice never rose. And they trusted me when I rebuilt every safeguard currently preventing this company from imploding. Across the table, Charles Whitmore removed his glasses and rubbed both eyes slowly. The confidence that had filled the room earlier that morning had vanished completely now. Nobody looked victorious anymore. They looked exposed. Angela opened another document beside Naomi and slid it across carefully. You should probably see this, she said softly. Naomi scanned the page. Internal board communications. Messages exchanged between Richard, Ethan, and several outside consultants over the previous 72 hours. Investor. Concerns. Market optics. Leadership image. Then one sentence near the bottom stopped her completely. We need someone the board can present without controversy during acquisition season. Naomi read it twice. Not because she misunderstood it. Because she understood it perfectly. Richard noticed the shift in her eyes immediately. That phrase was taken out of context, he said quickly. Naomi looked up at him. What exactly was the context? Nobody moved. Ethan exhaled sharply through his nose. This is becoming unproductive. Naomi almost smiled then. Not from amusement. From exhaustion. You know what is interesting, she said quietly. For years I thought the hardest part of this job would be building trust. Her fingers rested lightly against the notebook cover. Turns out the hardest part was realizing trust has conditions when you look like me. The room fell completely silent again. Outside, thunder rolled low and deep across Manhattan. One board member shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Another stared at the rain instead of at Naomi. Because nobody could honestly deny it now. Not after the emails. Not after the rushed vote before dawn. Not after replacing her before the market even opened. Ethan stood suddenly and walked toward the window, loosening his tie as city lights flickered across the glass. This company cannot survive a public scandal right now, he muttered. Naomi watched his reflection instead of his face. No, she said softly. But it also cannot survive leadership that mistakes prejudice for strategy. Then every screen in the room suddenly flashed red again. This time they did not recover. The boardroom lights dimmed for half a second before emergency backup systems quietly activated overhead. A cold white glow replaced the warm amber lighting that had filled the room earlier, washing every face in pale exhaustion. The polished walnut table no longer looked elegant. It looked clinical. Exposed. Every screen remained frozen in crimson warning colors, while system alerts stacked faster than analysts could clear them. One by one, phones began vibrating again across the table like nervous heartbeats. Ethan stared at the nearest monitor. Why are external transfers locked? He demanded. Who triggered containment protocols? The analyst nearest the screen swallowed visibly. The system triggered automatically after detecting executive inconsistencies. Then shut it down manually. We cannot. Ethan slammed his palm lightly against the table in frustration, not enough to cause a scene, but enough to break the careful corporate calm everyone had been clinging to all morning. Naomi watched him quietly. Rainwater slid down the massive windows behind him in crooked rivers while distant thunder rolled above the city. The storm outside finally matched the room inside. Richard Hale rubbed both hands slowly together beneath the table, a habit Naomi remembered from old negotiations years earlier. He only did that when he lost control of a situation before knowing how to recover it. Angela, Richard said carefully, there has to be a legal pathway to restore executive authority immediately. Angela looked down at the documents in front of her before answering. Possibly. Ethan stepped toward her instantly. Then do it. Angela lifted her eyes slowly. The problem is not restoring authority. She paused. The problem is proving the removal itself was legitimate. Silence. Ethan blinked once. Richard's expression hardened. Be careful with your wording. Angela did not look away. The timing of the vote, the pre-market execution, the altered authorization chain, and the investor correspondence create significant exposure if reviewed externally. Charles Whitmore removed his glasses again. Exposure meaning what exactly? Angela's voice remained steady, meaning it could appear the board acted based on perception concerns instead of operational failure. Nobody moved after that. Naomi could almost hear people thinking, replaying conversations, emails, side comments whispered during private dinners and investor calls. Stable image, market comfort, executive optics. The language had always been polished enough to sound respectable, until somebody placed all the pieces together in one room. Ethan exhaled sharply and turned back toward the windows. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. Nobody questioned Naomi's performance. Naomi finally spoke. "No. You questioned whether people were comfortable seeing me in the position." Ethan turned toward her immediately. "That is not what I said. It is exactly what your emails said." Her voice stayed calm. That calmness was becoming unbearable now. The room felt colder every time she refused to raise her voice. Richard stood slowly from his chair, adjusting his suit jacket with practiced control. "This conversation is becoming emotional," he said. Naomi looked at him carefully. "Interesting." Richard frowned slightly. "What?" "Every time a woman notices bias," Naomi replied softly, "someone suddenly calls it emotion instead of evidence." A long silence followed. Even Ethan did not interrupt this time. Outside, lightning flashed across the clouds, briefly illuminating the entire skyline in silver-white light. Naomi glanced toward the rain-covered windows and, for a brief moment, remembered her father polishing floors inside another Manhattan skyscraper 30 years earlier. She remembered sitting beside him after school doing homework while executives walked past without seeing either of them. Her father used to tell her something quietly whenever people looked through her instead of at her. "Let them underestimate you. It makes the truth louder later." Naomi returned her attention to the room. Analysts continued typing nervously. Executives whispered behind raised hands. The company stock had already dropped 7% in less than an hour. And still nobody had asked the one question that mattered most. Naomi noticed it before anyone else. The silence around the trading floor feed. Too quiet. Then suddenly one of the junior analysts looked up from his screen, face completely pale. "Sir," he whispered toward Richard, "federal investigators are requesting immediate live access to this meeting." Nobody in the room spoke for nearly 3 full seconds after the analyst finished the sentence. The silence felt dense now, heavy enough to press against the glass walls of the boardroom. Federal investigators. Live access. Not a request for documents. Not an email. They wanted to enter the meeting itself. Ethan Pierce slowly turned away. From the windows, his face drained of the polished confidence he had carried all morning. "On what grounds?" he asked sharply. The junior analyst stared at the screen. "Potential executive misconduct tied to unauthorized governance restructuring." Richard Hale immediately straightened his posture, slipping back into the controlled tone that had guided him through decades of shareholder crises and televised hearings. "Nobody authorizes outside access without legal review." Angela looked at him carefully. "Richard, they already have legal review." That landed harder than shouting would have. Rain battered the windows in steady waves while pale emergency lights reflected across the polished walnut table like cold water. Naomi remained seated at the far end of the room, hands folded calmly beside her notebook. She noticed every small thing now. The nervous tapping of fingers. The way Charles Whitmore kept removing and replacing his glasses. The way Ethan's jaw tightened every time another notification appeared on his screen. Fear always made powerful people suddenly human. One of the board members finally whispered what several others had clearly been thinking. "How much do they know?" Angela glanced toward the frozen compliance feed before answering. Enough to notice that executive authority was altered less than 2 hours before several protected accounts triggered containment locks. Richard looked toward Naomi for the first time in several minutes. "You could stop this." Naomi met his gaze evenly. "Could I? The company needs stability right now." Naomi almost laughed at the irony of hearing that word again. Stability. It was the same word they used when they removed her before sunrise. The same word investors used when they smiled politely, while questioning whether leadership felt relatable. The same word people used when competence from a black woman made them uncomfortable in rooms built by older white men. Ethan stepped closer to the table. This does not need to become public. Naomi looked at him quietly. You made it public the moment you decided appearances mattered more than truth. Nobody interrupted her this time, because the room had already started turning against itself. The confidence that united them earlier that morning had fractured completely under pressure. Naomi could see it in the way executives avoided defending one another now. Self-preservation had entered the room. Outside, another flash of lightning illuminated the skyline beyond the glass. For a split second, Naomi saw her own reflection staring back at her in the dark window. Calm eyes, controlled breathing. Her father used to tell her something else too whenever people underestimated her. Never interrupt someone while they are revealing who they are. They had revealed everything this morning. Richard inhaled slowly. Naomi, he said carefully, softer now. Whatever disagreements happened here, they can still be handled internally. Naomi tilted her head slightly. Disagreements. Richard held her gaze. You know what I mean. No, she replied quietly. I know exactly what happened. The room fell still again. Angela closed another folder softly. Federal access request expires in 4 minutes, she said. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, pacing now near the windows overlooking Manhattan. If this hits the market before opening bell stabilization, we are finished. Naomi finally stood from her chair. Slowly, calmly. The movement alone made several people straighten instinctively. She walked toward the rain-covered windows, heels clicking softly against hardwood floors while every eye followed her. The city stretched beneath the storm in silver and gray blur, endless buildings disappearing into low clouds. Naomi stared at the skyline for a long moment before speaking again. Do you know what the saddest part is? She asked softly. Nobody answered. I spent 4 years protecting this company from predators outside these walls. She turned toward them then. I never realized the real threat was sitting inside the boardroom the entire time. And at that exact moment, the massive conference screen behind Richard Hale suddenly switched on by itself. The massive conference screen flickered once, bathing the boardroom in cold blue light. Every conversation stopped instantly. Ethan turned sharply from the windows while Richard Hale froze. Beside the head of the table, his expression tightening as unfamiliar system prompts appeared across the display. Access log restoration initiated. Beneath the message, rows of timestamps began scrolling slowly down the screen. Internal authorization records. Deleted communications. Archive governance changes. Somebody whispered. Who activated that? Naomi said nothing. She stood near the rain-covered windows with Manhattan glowing dimly behind her, arms resting loosely at her sides while pale lightning flashed across the clouds outside. The room no longer felt like a board meeting. Felt like exposure. Angela looked toward the display carefully. The backup integrity system, she said quietly. It only activates when executive tampering is detected. Ethan's face lost what little color remained. Turn it off. I cannot, Angela replied. Neither can you. More files appeared. Executive override logs. Timestamps from before dawn. Security clearance removals. Internal board messages flagged by the system itself as a regular governance activity. Richard stepped closer to the screen. This is confidential material. Naomi finally spoke from across the room. It was confidential when you assumed nobody else would see it. Silence again. One of the junior analysts shifted nervously in his chair while another quietly lowered the brightness on his tablet, as though dimming the screen could somehow reduce the reality unfolding around them. Rain hammered the windows harder now, turning the skyline beyond the glass into a blur of silver and charcoal shadows. Ethan reached for the remote control on the table. The screen immediately rejected the command. Access denied. His breathing visibly changed after that. Faster now. Less controlled. Naomi watched him carefully. Earlier that morning, he had sat comfortably in her chair speaking about investor confidence and leadership optics. Now he looked like a man realizing the floor beneath him was not stable after all. A new file opened automatically across the screen. Audio transcript recovered. Richard's face hardened immediately. Disable that now. Nobody moved. The transcript began scrolling line by line across the Boardroom display. Investors are nervous about presentation. We need somebody safer for acquisition season. Safer. The word seemed to echo silently through the room. Ethan immediately spoke up. That was not referring to race. But nobody responded to him quickly enough. Because deep down, every person in that room understood exactly what had been meant. Naomi lowered her eyes briefly. Not from weakness. From exhaustion. There was something deeply tiring about watching people pretend language had no meaning after hiding behind it for years. Charles Whitmore slowly sat back in his chair. Jesus Christ, he whispered under his breath. Richard turned toward Naomi. You designed this system. Naomi nodded once. After the Mercer scandal, you built a mechanism that records internal executive tampering? I built a system that protects the company from corruption. Richard stared at her. Including us. Naomi held his gaze calmly. Especially executives. Another alert flashed across the massive screen. Federal access window. 1 minute and 42 seconds remaining. Ethan looked around the room desperately now. If investigators see incomplete internal context, they will assume intent. Angela closed her legal folder slowly. Intent becomes difficult to dispute when the documentation already exists. Nobody argued with her. Outside, thunder rolled low and heavy across the city. Naomi stepped away from the windows at last, heels clicking softly across the hardwood floor while every eye followed her movement. She stopped beside the massive conference table and looked directly at the screen displaying the recovered transcript. Safer. The word still glowed there in pale white letters. Naomi remembered hearing versions of that word her entire life. Safer candidate. Safer choice. Safer image. She remembered teachers surprised by her intelligence. Investors complimenting how articulate she sounded. Men shaking her hand while secretly wondering if she belonged in the room at all. Richard's voice broke the silence carefully. Naomi, what exactly do you want? She looked at him for a long moment before answering. I wanted honesty. The room fell still again. Then the screen changed one final time. New footage loaded automatically from internal security archives. Date stamp, 5:12 a.m. boardroom executive level. And suddenly Richard Hale stopped breathing normally. The security footage loaded slowly across the massive conference screen, grainy at first beneath flickering timestamps and pale surveillance lighting. Nobody in the room moved. Even the storm outside seemed quieter for a moment, as though Manhattan itself had paused to watch. Then the image sharpened. Boardroom executive level. 5:12 a.m. Richard Hale appeared first, stepping through the darkened conference room carrying a leather portfolio beneath one arm. Ethan Pierce followed seconds later holding a tablet and a sealed envelope. The room in the footage looked almost ghostly without daylight. Empty chairs. Dim hallway lights spilling across polished floors. The same room they all sat in now, only colder somehow. Present-day Richard stared at the screen without blinking. This footage is incomplete, he said immediately, but his voice lacked the authority it carried earlier that morning. Nobody responded. On screen, Ethan walked directly toward the head of the table and removed Naomi's brass nameplate from the CEO seat. He hesitated for half a second before setting it face down beside his tablet. The tiny metallic sound echoed faintly through the boardroom speakers. Present-day Ethan looked away from the screen immediately after that. Angela folded her hands together slowly. Charles Whitmore stared openly now, no longer pretending confusion. The footage continued. Richard opened the leather portfolio and removed internal governance forms already signed before the official board vote had even occurred. Timestamps glowed clearly in the upper corner of the screen. Naomi watched the footage silently from beside the windows. Not triumphantly. Not angrily. Just quietly. Because none of this surprised her anymore. What surprised her was how carelessly they had done it. Like they believed nobody would ever challenge them. On screen Ethan spoke first. The audio crackled softly through hidden conference speakers. Investors will relax once she is out. Present-day Ethan immediately straightened. That is not the full conversation. But his voice sounded thinner now. Smaller somehow. The footage did not stop. Richard lowered himself into the CEO chair while reviewing documents. The market needs familiarity, he said calmly in the recording. Right now people are nervous. Ethan nodded. Especially after the Singapore situation. Richard leaned back in Naomi's chair. They trusted her during recovery, he admitted. But trust during crisis is different from long-term perception. Silence swallowed the room again. Naomi could feel people around the table avoiding eye contact now, not with her, but with each other. The language sounded even uglier spoken aloud than it had looked in emails. Because now tone existed too. Casual. Comfortable. Certain. The kind of certainty people develop when they assume nobody vulnerable will ever hear what they really think. The footage paused automatically. Present-day Richard finally stepped forward. This board has every legal right to restructure executive leadership. Naomi looked at him quietly. That is the defense you are choosing? Richard's jaw tightened. Do not turn this into something it was not. Naomi stared at him for several long seconds before answering. You know what hurts the most? Her voice remained calm. It is not that you removed me. Rain streaked down the windows behind her while emergency lights reflected silver against the glass. It is that after everything I built here, after every crisis I solved for this company, after every quarter I carried this board through, you still looked at me and saw risk before leadership. Nobody breathed normally after that sentence. Charles lowered his eyes toward the table. One executive quietly muted his phone because the constant alerts had become unbearable. Ethan rubbed both hands across his face before speaking again. This was about investor confidence. Naomi nodded once. Yes. Her eyes moved slowly across the room. That is what people always call it when fear wears a suit. Outside, thunder rolled low across Manhattan again. The conference screen flickered one final time. Then a new message appeared in bright white letters across the dark display. Federal Observer access granted. Live connection initiating. And suddenly nobody in the room looked powerful anymore. The conference screen shifted from recorded footage to a live federal connection window framed in stark white borders. The seal of the Financial Regulatory Commission appeared in the center, while the boardroom lights reflected dimly across the glass display. Nobody sat comfortably anymore. Ties had loosened. Coffee sat untouched. Faces that had entered the room polished and confident now looked pale beneath the cold emergency lighting. Naomi remained standing beside the windows, rain tracing silver lines behind her, while the city blurred beneath the storm outside. Richard Hale slowly returned to his chair at the head of the table, but even that movement felt different now. Smaller. The authority that once filled the room around him had thinned visibly. A voice came through the speakers, calm and official. This session is now under temporary observation pending review of executive governance procedures and compliance integrity. Ethan Pierce leaned forward immediately. There has been a misunderstanding regarding internal restructuring. Naomi closed her eyes briefly at the word misunderstanding. Corporate language always became softer when consequences arrived. The federal representative continued. We are currently reviewing executive authorization irregularities connected to protected financial systems, triggered this morning. Angela quietly slid another document toward Richard. He barely glanced at it before placing both hands flat against the table. Naomi noticed the slight tremor in his fingers. The company remains stable, Richard said carefully into the microphone. Operational safeguards functioned exactly as intended. Naomi looked toward him slowly after that sentence. Because for the first time all morning, Richard had accidentally admitted the truth. The safeguards worked because of her. The room seemed to realize it simultaneously. Ethan noticed too. His jaw tightened as he turned toward Richard sharply, but Richard avoided eye contact completely. The federal voice spoke again. One question remains central to this review. Why was executive authority removed from the architect of those safeguards less than 2 hours before compliance instability began? Silence. Real silence. Nobody reached for a tablet. Nobody checked a phone. Outside, thunder rolled low over Manhattan while lightning flashed faintly behind the rain-covered skyline. Naomi could hear the soft hum of the ventilation system overhead, and the distant sound of sirens far below in the city streets. Tiny details suddenly felt louder when power collapsed in a room. Ethan finally answered first. The board acted in the interest of investor confidence. Naomi lowered her eyes briefly. There it was again. The phrase they kept hiding behind. Investor confidence. Market stability. Safer image. Polished language wrapped around the same ugly truth. The federal representative paused for a moment before asking quietly, "Was Ms. Carter's performance under review?" Nobody answered immediately because the answer was obvious. Vail and Mercer had reached record profits under Naomi's leadership. Regulatory penalties had dropped. Expansion succeeded. Internal corruption had nearly disappeared. Her numbers spoke louder than anyone in the room could. Richard finally cleared his throat. Performance was not the issue. Naomi looked toward him. Slowly, carefully. Richard stared at the conference table while speaking, not at her. Certain stakeholders expressed concerns regarding public positioning during acquisition negotiations. Charles Whitmore closed his eyes briefly after hearing that sentence aloud. Ethan shifted uncomfortably near the windows. Angela looked down at her legal folder without speaking, because everybody finally understood how terrible it sounded once exposed to daylight. Naomi stepped away from the windows then, her heels soft against the hardwood floor, while the federal connection remained open on the massive screen behind Richard. She stopped beside the center of the table and rested one hand lightly against the back of an empty chair. "Do you know what is remarkable?" she asked softly. Nobody interrupted her. Not one person in this room questioned my decisions during the years this company made billions. Her eyes moved slowly across the board members. But the moment the crisis passed, suddenly leadership became about image again. Rain streaked across the towering windows behind her while pale city lights shimmered through the storm outside. "You trusted my mind when things were broken," Naomi continued quietly. "You just did not trust my face once things became comfortable." Nobody breathed normally after that. Richard's shoulders lowered slightly for the first time all morning, almost like the weight of something long hidden had finally become too heavy to hold upright. Then the federal representative spoke one final sentence that froze the room completely. "Miss Carter," the voice asked calmly, "are you willing to resume emergency executive control immediately?" The question hung in the boardroom like suspended glass. "Miss Carter, are you willing to resume emergency executive control immediately?" Nobody moved after hearing it. Rain pressed against the towering windows in restless waves while pale emergency lights reflected across exhausted faces and untouched coffee cups. Naomi stood beside the conference table with one hand resting lightly against the chair back, her expression unreadable beneath the cold white lighting overhead. Ethan Pierce stared at her openly now, no arrogance left in his posture. Richard Hale looked older somehow, smaller, like the morning had stripped something from him that money and status could not restore. The federal representative waited through the silence without repeating the question. Naomi glanced slowly around the room. The same executives who had avoided her eyes hours earlier were watching her carefully now. Not because she held the title again, because suddenly they understood how much had depended on her long before the title existed. Naomi remembered her father again. The smell of industrial floor polish on his work uniform after midnight shifts. The sound of elevator doors opening while executives walked past him carrying expensive briefcases without ever learning his name. He used to come home exhausted, hands rough from chemicals and cold water, yet somehow still smiling when he told her, "Never let bitterness become the loudest thing in the room." She understood those words differently now. Ethan finally spoke, quieter than before. "Naomi, if the system is not stabilized before markets fully react, thousands of employees could be affected." Naomi looked toward him calmly. Hours earlier he had spoken about her like a problem to manage. Now his voice carried something unfamiliar. Regret, maybe. Or fear. Probably both. Richard slowly removed his glasses and rubbed a hand across his face. "I was wrong," he said quietly. The room turned toward him instantly. Richard stared down at the conference table while speaking. "Not about your capability. Never that." His voice tightened slightly. "I told myself this was about optics. Investors. Market comfort. But the truth is..." He stopped for a second, jaw flexing hard beneath the pale light. "The truth is I underestimated how much my own thinking had been shaped by the people around me." Naomi said nothing. Richard looked up at her finally. "You built this company into something stronger than any of us expected. And instead of accepting that fully, I started worrying whether the board would ever see you the way they saw men like me." The room remained completely still. Nobody interrupted because nobody could deny it anymore. Charles Whitmore lowered his eyes again. One executive quietly turned off his phone altogether, unable to listen to another market alert. Rain slid down the windows behind Naomi like silver threads, while the skyline beyond disappeared beneath clouds and storm light. "Do you know what is strange?" Naomi asked softly. Richard waited. "I spent years believing if I worked twice as hard, spoke carefully enough, carried every crisis without complaint, eventually I would stop having to prove I belonged here." Her fingers tightened slightly against the chair back. "But some people never stop asking for proof. They just learn to ask politely." Ethan looked away after hearing that. The federal representative spoke again through the conference speakers. "Ms. Carter, we require an answer regarding Executive Stabilization Authority." Naomi closed her eyes briefly. Just one breath. One quiet second in a room full of people who had finally been forced to confront themselves. She could walk away now. Nobody would blame her. The board had humiliated her before sunrise, removed her authority, questioned her image while depending on the system she built. Part of her wanted to leave them sitting there inside their collapsing certainty. But then she thought about the employees downstairs. Analysts, receptionists, custodians. Thousands of ordinary people whose lives depended on decisions made in rooms they would never enter. Naomi opened her eyes again. "Calm, steady. Reconnect my executive access," she said quietly. Several people exhaled at once. But Naomi was not finished. She looked directly at Richard Hale. "I am doing this for the company." Her voice stayed soft. "Not for the people who forgot what integrity looks like." Then she stepped toward the head of the table while every person in the room silently moved out of her way. The room parted for Naomi without a single word being spoken. Chairs shifted softly against hardwood floors as executives moved aside instinctively, watching her walk toward the head of the table where Ethan Pierce had been sitting only minutes earlier with polished confidence and investor-approved smiles. Now he stepped back silently, one hand still resting against the chair for half a second before letting go completely. Naomi noticed the uneven edge of the temporary brass nameplate bearing Ethan's name. Cheap adhesive still clung beneath it. She removed it calmly and placed it beside the untouched coffee cups without saying a word. Then she lowered herself into the CEO chair again. The leather creaked softly beneath her weight. Familiar. Cold. Real. The conference room remained completely silent except for rain tapping steadily against the massive windows overlooking Manhattan. The Federal Connection stayed active on the giant display, while compliance alerts continued scrolling faintly across smaller screens around the room. Naomi opened her laptop slowly. This time the system welcomed her immediately. Executive authorization confirmed. Several analysts visibly relaxed after the message appeared. Naomi's fingers moved carefully across the keyboard while encrypted. Dashboards reopened one by one beneath pale blue light. Offshore controls. Fraud containment systems. International verification chains. Every safeguard she built over 4 years unfolded across the screens like the hidden framework beneath a skyscraper finally revealed. "Restoring Singapore authorization sequence," she said calmly. "Reactivating internal firewall protocols." The analysts around the room immediately returned to work, their hands moving quickly now that direction existed again. Numbers stabilized gradually across the trading dashboards. Red indicators faded to amber. Amber slowly shifted toward neutral white. The panic inside the boardroom eased inch by inch with every command Naomi entered. Ethan watched from near the windows, shoulders tense beneath the reflection of rain and city lights. "You memorized all of this?" he asked quietly. Naomi did not look up from the screen. "I designed it." The answer landed softly, but nobody missed the meaning beneath it. Richard Hale remained seated farther down the table now instead of at the head. Naomi noticed that too. Earlier that morning he occupied space like the room naturally belonged to him. Now he sat with both hands folded quietly in front of him, watching the woman he underestimated rebuild order from the chaos he helped create. The federal representative spoke again through the overhead speakers. "Market volatility is decreasing. Stabilization protocols appear effective." Angela allowed herself the smallest breath of relief while reviewing legal updates beside Naomi. "International accounts are unlocking in sequence," she confirmed softly. Charles Whitmore leaned back slowly in his chair, staring at Naomi with something close to disbelief. My God, he muttered under his breath. She built the entire safety net herself. Naomi heard him but said nothing. Her attention remained fixed on the glowing screens before her while rainwater slid endlessly down the windows behind the boardroom. Outside, Manhattan still looked blurred beneath storm clouds. But inside the room the panic had begun to settle into something heavier. Shame. Richard finally stood from his chair. The movement drew quiet attention from everyone around the table. He walked slowly toward Naomi, stopping several feet away like a man suddenly uncertain how close he deserved to stand. Naomi, he said quietly. She kept typing for another few seconds before looking up. Richard swallowed once. I owe you more than an apology. Naomi studied him calmly beneath the pale emergency lights. Yes, she replied softly. Richard lowered his eyes briefly. I spent so much time worrying about how the world would respond to your leadership that I never realized your leadership was the reason this company survived at all. Ethan looked down at the floor after hearing that. Angela remained silent, but Naomi noticed the slight tension leaving her shoulders for the first time all morning. The federal representative interrupted gently. Miss Carter, with your authorization restored, emergency review procedures will likely conclude without suspension. Naomi nodded once. Understood. Then she glanced slowly around the room at every executive seated there. Some avoided her eyes out of embarrassment. Others looked at her differently now, as though seeing her clearly for the first time. Not as a symbol, not as a risk, not as an image problem, as the person who had quietly carried all of them for years. Naomi closed one final authorization window and leaned back slightly in the chair. Outside, the rain finally began to soften against the glass. By late afternoon, the storm above Manhattan had finally begun to break apart. Rain still clung to the glass walls of the 48th floor, but sunlight now pushed faintly through the clouds in pale gold streaks, reflecting softly across the boardroom windows and polished hardwood floors. The crisis screens had gone quiet. Compliance alerts disappeared one by one. Market indicators stabilized into steady lines instead of violent drops. Around the massive walnut table, exhaustion settled over everyone like a second layer of clothing. Ties loosened, sleeves rolled up. Empty coffee cups stood abandoned beside scattered legal folders and dimmed tablets. The federal connection had ended nearly 20 minutes earlier with formal notice that emergency review procedures would remain. Internal pending corrective governance action. Nobody celebrated. There was no energy left for victory. Naomi Carter sat alone at the head of the table reviewing the final stabilization reports while the room slowly emptied around her. Analysts exited quietly first, murmuring soft thank yous as they passed. Then the junior executives followed, avoiding unnecessary conversation, carrying laptops against their chests like shields. Several paused before leaving entirely, glancing back toward Naomi with expressions that looked almost ashamed. She acknowledged each one with the same calm nod. No bitterness. No performance. Just quiet dignity. Ethan Pierce remained near the windows for a long time after everyone else started leaving. The skyline beyond him looked washed clean beneath the fading storm, silver sunlight reflecting off wet rooftops and distant skyscraper glass. He finally approached the table slowly, hands folded awkwardly in front of him. I thought I understood leadership, he admitted quietly. Naomi closed the final report on her screen but did not immediately respond. Ethan exhaled softly. I kept telling myself this was about investors, public image, stability. He looked down briefly before meeting her eyes again. But somewhere along the way, I stopped questioning why leadership only looked believable to people when it came in certain packaging. Naomi studied him carefully. The arrogance that entered the room with him that morning was gone completely now. In its place stood a man confronting the ugliest parts of himself without excuses left to hide behind. Bias rarely announces itself honestly, Naomi said softly. Most of the time it disguises itself as professionalism. Ethan nodded once slowly. I see that now. He stepped back after that, offering no dramatic apology, no attempt to erase what happened. Just truth. And somehow the honesty of it felt heavier than performance ever could. Richard Hale remained seated farther down the table, staring out at the fading rain beyond the windows. Age seemed more visible on him now beneath the softer evening light. Your father worked in buildings like this, did he not? He asked quietly without turning around. Naomi looked toward him. Yes. Richard nodded slowly. Mine too. That surprised her enough to stay silent. Richard gave a tired smile that barely appeared. Different floors. Same silence. The room grew still again after that. Outside, the clouds continued pulling apart above Manhattan, while golden evening light slowly spread across the skyline. Naomi rose from the CEO chair at last and walked toward the windows overlooking the city below. Her reflection appeared faintly against the glass beside the glowing lights outside. A black woman standing 48 floors above the streets where her father once polished marble floors after midnight shifts. For years she thought success would finally make rooms like this see her clearly. But now she understood something different. Some people only learn to see clearly after nearly losing everything. Behind her, nobody sat in the CEO chair after she stood up. Not Ethan. Not Richard. Not anyone. The chair remained empty beneath the soft evening light, while the city breathed quietly beyond the rain-streaked glass. Naomi rested one hand lightly against the cool window and looked out over Manhattan as the last of the storm drifted away. They thought they were removing a woman from power. In the end, they realized she had been the one holding the entire company together all along.